There were operations during the Cold War that never appeared in newspapers. No headlines, no public acknowledgement, no official confirmation, because if they were ever exposed, they could trigger something far worse than a political crisis. They could trigger war. Behind a visible conflict, missiles, bombers, naval fleets, there was another battlefield, hidden, silent, where intelligence was gathered without permission, where technology was deployed without detection, and where success depended on one thing above all else: remaining invisible. This is the story of a CIA operation the Soviets never discovered, a mission carried out deep inside enemy-controlled territory, without a single shot fired. At the height of the Cold War, the United States faced a fundamental problem. It needed to understand the Soviet Union, not just what was visible, but what was hidden: missile deployments, command structures, communication networks, the systems that controlled one of the most powerful military forces on Earth. Because without that knowledge, every decision was made in uncertainty, and uncertainty in a nuclear standoff was dangerous. The Soviet Union was a closed system, its borders tightly controlled, its internal operations protected by layers of security. Traditional intelligence methods had limits. Human agents could only go so far. Surveillance aircraft risked escalation. Signals intelligence captured fragments, but not the full picture. And yet, somewhere inside that system, critical information was constantly moving. Orders, reports, strategic decisions, all transmitted through secure communication networks. If those communications could be accessed, the United States wouldn't have to guess. It would know. That idea became the foundation of the operation. Not to observe from a distance, not to estimate, but to listen directly, to access the flow of information at its source. But doing that required something unprecedented, because the target wasn't a building or a base. It was a system, a network designed to carry sensitive military communications across vast distances, protected, buried, hidden from any obvious point of access. Reaching would require entering territory where detection was almost guaranteed, operating in an environment where any mistake could expose the entire mission. And once exposed, there would be no denial, no recovery, only consequences. Still, the potential value was too great to ignore, because if the operation succeeded, it wouldn't just provide intelligence. It would provide clarity, continuous, reliable, unfiltered, a direct view into the decision-making process of the Soviet military. But success depended on one condition. The Soviets could never know it existed. Not during the mission, not after, not ever. Because the moment they discovered it, everything would change. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where the most important missions were the ones no one ever saw, consider subscribing, because what this operation would soon attempt was something far more dangerous than flying over enemy territory. It was entering it and leaving something behind, something that would listen long after the mission was over. The operation began with a simple question: where could they access the system without being seen? Because the Soviet communication network wasn't exposed. It didn't run through open infrastructure. It was designed for security, buried underground, running across remote regions, carrying military communications between key command locations. But even the most secure systems have vulnerabilities, points where they must pass through terrain, where physical access, however difficult, becomes possible. And one of those points existed in a place few would expect: the ocean. In certain areas, critical Soviet communication cables extended beneath the sea, linking installations, transmitting information across distances, protected not by guards or walls, but by isolation, depth, and the assumption that no one could reach them. But the United States had something the Soviets underestimated: submarines capable of operating in those environments, quietly, precisely, without detection. If a submarine could locate the cable and reach it, then access might be possible. But that was only the beginning, because finding a cable on the ocean floor was not simple. It required navigation at extreme depth, sonar interpretation, careful movement to avoid detection, And even then, the margin for error was almost non-existent. Once a location was identified, the next challenge emerged. How do you tap into a cable without interrupting it? Because any disruption could alert Soviet monitoring systems. Any visible damage could trigger an inspection. And once that happened, the operation would be compromised. The solution had to be invisible. A device that could attach to the cable, capture the signals, and do it without altering the flow of communication. No interference, no detectable change, only observation. Designing that device required a level of precision that went beyond conventional engineering. It had to function in deep-sea conditions. Pressure, cold, darkness, and it had to operate continuously, recording data, storing information, without requiring constant human interaction, because once deployed, it would be left behind. And that introduced another layer of complexity, retrieval, because collecting the data meant returning to the same location, finding the device again, and doing it without being detected. The operation wasn't a single mission. It was a cycle: insertion, monitoring, extraction, repeated over time. Each phase carrying its own risks. Each phase dependent on absolute secrecy. Inside the submarine, crews prepared for something unlike traditional missions. This wasn't about engagement or confrontation. It was about precision, careful movement, controlled actions, because every sound, every movement had the potential to expose them. And exposure in this environment would not just end the mission. It could trigger a diplomatic crisis, or worse. Still, the operation moved forward because the value of success outweighed the risks. Because if it worked, the United States would gain something unprecedented: direct access to Soviet military communications. Not estimates, not fragments, but the actual flow of information. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where the most daring missions weren't about combat, but about silence and precision, consider subscribing, because what would happen next was one of the most delicate operations ever attempted. Because reaching the cable was one thing, attaching to it without being detected was something else entirely. Reaching the cable was only the beginning, because now everything had to happen without a trace. The submarine descended slowly, deeper, into an environment where light no longer existed. Only instruments, only sonar, guiding them through the darkness. The ocean floor came into view, not as a landscape, but as a series of shapes, contours, irregularities, and somewhere within that terrain, the cable, thin, silent, carrying some of the most sensitive military communications in the world. Finding it required patience, careful scanning, interpreting faint returns on sonar, because at that depth, nothing was obvious. And once it was located, the most critical phase began. The submarine had to position itself precisely, close enough to deploy the device, but without making contact, without disturbing the environment, because even a small disruption could be detected. Specialized equipment was brought forward. Divers were not an option. The depth made that impossible. Instead, mechanical systems were used, carefully controlled, extended from the submarine toward the cable. Every movement deliberate, slow, because speed increased risk, and risk meant exposure. The device itself was unlike anything used before, designed to wrap around the cable without cutting it, without altering its structure. It didn't tap into the line in a traditional sense. It listened, capturing the electromagnetic signals passing through the cable, recording them, storing them, all without interrupting the flow. To the Soviet system, nothing had changed. The communication continued as normal. Messages sent, orders transmitted, completely unaware that every signal was being captured. Once the device was secured, the submarine withdrew, slowly, leaving behind something that would continue the mission long after the crew was gone. And then, for a time, nothing happened. No alarms, no inspections, no indication that the operation had been discovered, which meant one thing: it worked. Weeks later, the submarine returned, navigating back to the same location, repeating the process in reverse, locating the device, retrieving the stored data, and once again, leaving without a trace. When the information was analyzed, the results were immediate, clear, detailed, authentic. Soviet military communications, unfiltered, providing insight into operations capabilities and decision-making, not through estimation, but through direct access. It was a level of intelligence that had never been achieved before, and it changed everything, because now the United States could understand not just what the Soviet Union was doing, but how it was thinking, what it prioritized, how it responded, patterns that could be tracked over time, decisions that could be anticipated. The operation continued, cycle after cycle, each mission reinforcing the system, each retrieval adding to the intelligence picture, all without detection, all without acknowledgement. It became one of the most valuable sources of information during the Cold War, but it also carried a constant risk, because the longer it operated, the greater the chance that something could go wrong. A routine inspection, an unexpected anomaly, anything that might lead to discovery. And if it were discovered, the consequences would be immediate, because this was an observation from a distance. This was direct intrusion, deep inside a system the Soviets believed was secure. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where the most important victories were achieved without anyone ever knowing, consider subscribing, because what this operation had accomplished was something almost impossible. It had entered one of the most protected systems in the world and turned it into a source of information. But even the most perfect operation cannot remain hidden forever. For years, the operation remained invisible. No alerts, no discoveries, no indication that anything was wrong. The system worked exactly as intended. Messages continued to flow, commands transmitted, decisions made, all of it captured without interruption. From the Soviet perspective, nothing had changed. Their communications were secure, their network intact, their secrets protected. But beneath the surface, that wasn't true, because every message carried through that cable was being heard, analyzed, understood. For the United States, the value was extraordinary. It provided insight that no satellite could capture, no aircraft could observe, no human source could safely deliver. It revealed patterns, operational behavior, strategic priorities, the rhythm of a system that had once been hidden behind layers of secrecy. And that information shaped decisions, quietly, without public acknowledgement, because its power depended on one thing, remaining unknown. But in the Cold War, even the most carefully protected operations face a reality that could not be controlled. People, because in the end, it wasn't technology that threatened the mission. It was exposure, the kind that doesn't come from detection, but from within. When the operation was eventually compromised, it wasn't because the Soviets found the device on their own. It was because the knowledge of its existence reached them. And in that moment, everything changed. The advantage disappeared. The system was no longer invisible. The operation ended, but its impact remained, because for the time it operated, it provided a level of clarity that shaped strategy, reduced uncertainty, and allowed decisions to be made with confidence. It demonstrated something fundamental about the Cold War. That intelligence was not just about observation. It was about access, direct, continuous, reliable, and that achieving that level of access required more than technology. It required precision, discipline, and the willingness to operate where detection could not be allowed. The legacy of the operation wasn't in how it ended. It was in what it proved, that even the most secure systems could be reached, that even the most protected communications could be accessed, and that in a conflict defined by secrecy, the side that could listen held an advantage that could not be measured in weapons, because information shaped everything: decisions, strategies, outcomes. And during the Cold War, the most powerful operations were often the ones no one ever saw. No explosions, no confrontation, just silence and the steady flow of information. For more stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because some of the most critical missions in history didn't rely on force. They relied on knowing more than the other side ever realized.